it's been a difficult few weeks. It's been really great to hear the contributions of others, particularly Frank's. You can tell somebody who is still at heart a politician when they turn up and say, well, I haven't made a speech here, but I can certainly say a few things. Or perhaps that's just of us who are from Merseyside, Frank, but anyway. The question before the panel is why we should remain, why we should stay a member of the European Union, and I just want to make 3 points in defence of our membership of the European Union, and then if I may, to kind of answer Kevin's test about whether we'll face this barrage of Nigel Farage and his friends shouting, tell them again at us, and what we might do about that if we do have another referendum. But before I come to my points in defence of the European Union and our membership of it, just to prove Frank's point, and it was Mario Cuomo, the federal governor of New York, I googled it, who said that you should campaign in poetry and govern in prose. But actually, to turn back to the European Union, the German philosopher Immanuel Kant said that ought implies can. So if we should stay in the European Union, then that will be dependent on whether or not we can stay in the European Union. So I think it's at least as an important question about whether we can. And I would say that the past month or so has most certainly been the worst and most difficult of my political life. Perhaps only the week that my friend Jo Cox was murdered on the streets of her constituency could surpass the past month in terms of the sense of difficulty that Westminster has faced to get a grip of the divides that it faces, the sense of crisis as we look towards the end of March, and the chronic lack of leadership, I think, on all sides, both across the parties and within, whereby I think the country must be looking at Westminster and thinking, where on earth is this going to end? And I feel as though that crisis has a source, and that source is the lack of compromise. Now, I think the whole discussion in Westminster could have been very different if we had sought a cross-party Brexit plan. There will be many people in this room who wouldn't have wanted to do that because they don't want Brexit of any form, a compromised one or another. But actually the fact is, in 2016, the country did vote to withdraw from the European Union. And if we were ever going to make a success of it, I am absolutely firm in the belief that it needed cross-party support. This is a generational decision, and therefore it needed that cross-party support. But that approach has never, ever, ever been forthcoming. Not after 2016, not after the general election, not after 75 of us broke the Labour whip to vote in support of an EEA type Brexit. It has never materialised. So as I'm stood here now, the question, so I can imagine that you all want to ask politicians is, are the ERG going to fold? Are they going to, in the end, vote with Theresa May and get her deal through the House of Commons? Now, hi George. I mean, George might know, but I have no idea. A Conservative Member of Parliament tried to explain the ERG to me the other day, and his words began, well, there are 4 factions within it. So when I said about the chronic lack of leadership, I really meant it. And this is a really, really, really challenging situation for us to be in. We are beholden to the Conservative Party as they are the major party in the government coalition, and those of us who are outside it feel like we have little or no power other than to put forward suggestions as to how a cross-party compromise might be reached. Anyway, that said, 3 brief points on why Britain should stay as a member of the European Union: globalisation, demography and inequality. First, globalisation, it's not going anywhere. the idea that all of a sudden countries are going to retreat to narrow nationalism, and that the presence of Donald Trump in the world means that corporate integration across borders will all of a sudden become impossible, and that we can somehow run our economies nationally as we once did in the 1950s, though I'm not even sure that we did it in the 1950s, I think is absolutely mad. And we've seen that with the growth of data-based companies, whether that's huge behemoths like Facebook, Google and Apple, or other kind of more entrepreneurial, smaller but very, very fast-growing companies. We can see that their ambitions will never stop at borders. They will never be national companies ever again. In fact, the idea that we somehow had this kind of golden era where economies were managed nationally, I think is an idea that the British people should always see to be false, given that we are the home of the so-called British Empire that used globalisation itself in an earlier form to build up great wealth. So the change in our economic structures across the world, with global corporations crossing national boundaries, definitely means that national regulation on more and more issues will become obsolete. The idea that the UK can regulate Facebook by itself is mad. And we already know the positive impact that transnational regulation on these sorts of activities can have. Think of GDPR, think of the joy we all had when we realised that because of European regulation, companies wouldn't be able to continually spam us all the time. And from the work that we've been doing in Westminster, trying to translate European economic regulation into domestic law, I can simply tell you that Westminster is not the right vehicle to regulate transnational corporations. We are a little way through the very many pieces of legislation that we need to do to introduce European legislation into UK law, and we have got to the point of deciding which statutory instruments are the most risky, the most egregious, the most potentially negative for our economy to scrutinise. But there is so much of it that we are simply not able to do, because one country alone can't possibly manage all of the risks in the modern globalised economy. As I was leaving Westminster, one of my colleagues who's on the Constitutional Affairs Committee told me that they'd been interviewing the civil servants about what's left to do before the end of March if we are to leave with no deal. They were expecting 1,000 statutory instruments, but thankfully the British Civil Service has now prioritised this to a mere 600 statutory instruments, so pieces of shortish pieces of legislation for us to go through. So perhaps if every Member of Parliament spent all their time between now and the end of March inspecting them all in detail, we might just about get through it, but it is an impossible task. So our country on its own can't possibly regulate the global economy, so let's join together with others. The simple way of describing that is staying in the European Union. Second point, our demographic challenge isn't going anywhere either. People have already talked about immigration, but did you know that today there are approximately 365 pensioners for every 1,000 working age people in the UK? The OBR tell us that by 2030 that will be 365 pensioners for 1,000 working age people in the UK. So quite a significant increase. So we have choices. And when I asked the chair of Migration Watch, the anti-immigration body, what he thought the right choice was, if we're not to welcome more people into our labour market, to try and get that ratio back more towards a sensible balance so that we can take care of older people properly, as we should, unless we are going to immediately and suddenly require families to have a whole lot more children, although we would still have something of a gap before those children could enter the labour market, unless we want to reintroduce child labour. His answer was the following: it is quite simple, increase the state pension age. Does anybody in this room think that Britain's older people will accept any further increases to the state pension age. I mean, I do not want to tell my mother that she should be working till 72. She will kill me. So she wasn't that happy when a state pension age got increased before. So this is just not okay. It is not okay to expect hard-working teachers, nurses, people who do manual jobs, people who work in food production and other things. It's not okay to expect them to work into their 70s. And that's why my personal view is that immigration has much to offer our country. We either can constantly have this problem of, like Japan does, of a growing older group that we cannot support, or we can say that immigration has a great deal to offer us. So we need to consider how to have that immigration, not if we're going to have it. And I'm currently sitting on the Immigration Bill Committee in the House of Commons, and this bill will end freedom of movement. And I'm very proud to say, I know there's a lot of grief being given to the Labour Party at the moment, and fair enough, right? But this week, the Labour Party in Parliament voted against the ending of free movement. And I'm glad that we did so, because if you need immigration as a country, you know, there's two ways that you can do it. You can either have a highly regulated environment where the government uses its power to offer immigration to other countries to barter in trade deals, or you can have a rules-based, principle-based immigration system where citizens have rights that they can enforce against governments and that they can plan their life on. And anybody who's been involved personally, or their family has, with the immigration system in our country as it applies to non-EU nationals will know that it can often feel arbitrary. And it can feel like governments have a huge amount of power over people's individual family lives. So that's why free movement, as it is expressed in the European Union, and the rights it confers on citizens of the European Union to allow them to move around and work as they choose, as they wish to fulfil opportunities, I think is the right way to go. Because it offers people in this country the chance to live and work where they would like to, but more importantly, as citizens, it offers us all rights and protections against a government that would seek to interfere with those rights and protections for its own ends. Reason number 2 for staying in the European Union, our rights. Point number 3. Now, later you're going to hear from the country's expert on what I'm about to talk about. Philip McCann is the finest regional economist that I think I've ever heard speak. He's also from Birkenhead. So Phil will give you the full rundown of all the reasons why, if you care about regional inequality between parts of our country, we really should be staying in the European Union. But in summary, we should all know this now because we can see the future. And that future is exemplified by the Conservatives' relationship with the DUP. What they have done is offered Northern Ireland economic development in exchange for votes, otherwise known as pork barrel politics. They are trying to do this with Labour MPs too. They're trying to tell them, if you want a bit of money for the Stoke ceramics industry, then we could really do with your votes over here, lads. Now, that is a dangerous road to go down, because you end up with economic development for political ends rather than for rational, fair opportunities for all areas of the country to develop themselves. The European Union does not operate on a system of pork barrel politics. It has programs that assess need, and where there are regions that are falling behind, it invests in those regions and it tries to bring them up to the place of other European regions that are moving ahead more quickly. Frank gave the whole story there about the European Union's programs to do that. And so I would simply ask people, do they want a world where politicians are doing back-scenes deals about votes for cash and investment in their district? Or do they want an economic policy that tries to balance out our country and sees growth everywhere? I think the answer is glaringly obvious, and that's why we should stay in the European Union. So whether it's that globalisation is not going anywhere and we need to work with countries, not against them, whether it's the fact that our country is ageing, we need immigration, and we should do it in a fair and a rights-based way, not in a random and self-interested way, or whether it is the fact that regional inequality will never, ever, ever be solved by a Westminster government simply interested in itself, then I think the reasons are absolutely clear for staying in the European Union. Finally, one of the ways in which we might seek to find compromise in Westminster is what has become known as the Kyle Wilson Compromise. That the Prime Minister can have her deal, but subject to public ratification. Now, there are two things that I want to say about this. Firstly, it cannot be the same as the 2016 referendum, and it can't be the same because the 2016 referendum was advisory, and it also offered people a general view about whether they wanted to remain or leave, but gave no specific details about what leaving meant, which is why we're in the mess that we are in now. So it cannot be an advisory referendum, it has to be a legislative referendum, where we define beforehand what the clauses in law will be that are brought about by the vote. A legislative referendum similar to the Good Friday Agreement referendum. But I won't go into the detail, it does have to be different. It also has to be different because we have to have positive reasons, we have to have advocacy for our pro-European sentiment. I mean, I could wax lyrical about the emotional reasons why I want to stay and why I'm a European, and why every time I think of that announcement of the city of Liverpool becoming European capital of culture, a bit of me cries on the inside. You know, I could give all of the emotional reasons, but I do think we also have to give rational and compelling reasons. And I hope that that is what I have done today. Kevin, you said, and a lot of people have said, that we will face an unassailable campaign that will be led by the slogan, "Tell them again." Well, in response to that, yes, I will give my positive reasons, but I would simply say to people who say they will tell us, tell them again, I will say, tell me again, you want this mess to continue? Because if we leave the European Union and we have to negotiate a trade deal, that won't happen before the European elections. It won't happen probably before we've had a general election in this country, because why would you negotiate with Theresa May? These things take 7 years to negotiate, so we could be doing this hellish month that George and I have just had in Westminster, we could be doing this for 10 years. So tell me again that you want 10 more years of this, and that will be my response.